The wind wasn't just wind. It was a predator, a shrieking entity of ice and fury clawing at the isolated log cabin perched like a defiant prayer in the Colorado high country. It howled through the inadequate chinking between logs, making the single glass pane rattle violently, a skeletal hand demanding to be let in. Outside, creation had dissolved into a blinding, swirling vortex of white. Snow, driven sideways with bullet-like force, piled in immense drifts that climbed the rough-hewn walls, entombing Sarah Mitchell and her newborn twins, Ethan and Emily, deeper within the frozen heart of winter 1873. The blizzard offered no quarter. Inside, the cold was a tangible thing, a chilling presence that seeped through the very wood, relentlessly stealing warmth from the meager fire dying in the stone hearth. Sarah shivered, pulling the threadbare quilt tighter around her aching shoulders. Her gaze, shadowed with exhaustion and fear, was fixed on the two impossibly small bundles nestled in a makeshift cradle near the dwindling flames. Miracles, born mere weeks ago into a world that had already ripped their father away. John, her strong, capable John. He'd built this cabin with calloused hands and hopeful dreams, envisioning a future carved from this unforgiving wilderness. But a swift, brutal fever had claimed him just before the first snows, leaving Sarah profoundly alone, heavily pregnant, and stranded miles from Willow Creek, the nearest pinprick of civilization. Now, existence was measured in handfuls of flour and the remaining logs for the fire. Both counts were terrifyingly low. The last strips of smoked venison John had carefully prepared were gone. The small sack of cornmeal felt lighter each time she touched it, a hollow reminder of their dwindling chances. She looked at the twins, their tiny faces serene in sleep, utterly unaware of the storm's external fury or the tempest of fear raging within their mother. How can I keep them warm? How can I feed them? Her own milk was thin, compromised by hunger and the gnawing stress that tightened her chest. Despair, sharp and cold as an icicle forming overhead, threatened to shatter the fragile shield of her maternal resolve. Stiffly, her body still protesting the recent trauma of childbirth, Sarah rose. Each movement was an effort against the penetrating cold. She selected one of the last precious logs and carefully placed it on the embers. Sparks momentarily flared, briefly illuminating the stark confines of her world. Rough walls bearing the marks of John's adze, a simple table and 2 chairs. He'd crafted a bed layered with patched quilts and the cradle. This small space was everything. Outside, the blizzard raged, obliterating landmarks, erasing paths, extinguishing hope. Willow Creek felt as distant as the moon. No one knew the true extent of her predicament. No one was searching. The thought landed with the crushing weight of the snowdrifts outside. They would freeze or they would starve. Likely both. Hot tears pricked her eyes, startling against her icy skin. No, she wouldn't cry. Not while they still breathed. For Ethan. For Emily. She knelt by the cradle, her chapped hand hovering protectively above them. Their soft, even breaths were the only sound that truly registered against the wind's demonic symphony. "I won't let you go," she whispered, her voice raspy, almost lost in the howl. "Your papa wouldn't want that, I promised him. I won't let you go." But the words felt fragile, hollow against the overwhelming power battering the cabin. Her eyes scanned the small room again, desperate, searching for some overlooked resource. A forgotten tin, a hidden pouch of salt, anything. There was nothing. Only the diminishing woodpile and the terrifying emptiness where food should have been. Days blurred into an indistinguishable stretch of frigid twilight, marked only by the relentless scream of the wind and the cyclical demands of the infants. Sarah rationed the remaining cornmeal with brutal efficiency, consuming barely enough to keep herself upright. praying her failing milk wouldn't vanish entirely. The wood dwindled alarmingly fast. With a heavy heart, she began breaking apart a spare chair John had been working on, its purpose unfulfilled. The sharp cracks of the wood splitting echoed like gunshots in the tense silence between gusts. Each piece fed to the hungry flames, feeling like a betrayal, like burning a piece of her husband, a fragment of their shared dream. The cold deepened its hold, numbing her fingers and toes even when huddled near the hearth. Sleep offered little respite, arriving in short, fitful bursts haunted by nightmares of encroaching darkness and the fading cries of her children. Then, on what she guessed was the fourth, or perhaps fifth day of the blizzard siege, a new sound pierced the monotonous roar, a heavy thud against the cabin door followed by muffled shouting, almost swallowed by the gale. Sarah froze, her heart leaping into her throat, pounding against her ribs like a frantic bird. Who could possibly be out in this white hell? A lost trapper? Another settler facing even worse odds? Or something else? Something dangerous? Fear, primal and cold, warred with a desperate, illogical surge of hope. Her hand instinctively closed around the heavy iron poker leaning against the hearth, her knuckles turning white. "Hello?" she called out, her voice thin and reedy, barely audible even to herself. The shouting came again, closer this time, slightly stronger, but the words were guttural, unfamiliar. Not English. Panic clamped down on her. Indians. Stories, often exaggerated, fueled by fear, of raids and violence flashed through her mind. John had always preached caution and respect towards the Ute and Comanche who sometimes traversed these mountains, but the settlers' fear was deeply ingrained, a constant undercurrent of life on the frontier. She backed away from the door, deliberately, positioning herself between it and the cradle, the poker held low, ready. Another heavy thump struck the door, making the sturdy plank shudder in its frame, then silence, punctuated only by the wind's relentless assault. Had they gone? Driven off by the sheer impossibility of the storm? Or were they waiting, listening? The seconds stretched into an eternity. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted into menacing shapes on the rough walls. Just as she began to persuade herself it had been a hallucination, a cruel trick of the wind and her own frayed nerves, a voice spoke again, startlingly clear and close, right outside the door. "Hello inside. Need shelter. Lost in storm." The English was heavily accented, the cadence unfamiliar, but the words were blessedly understandable. Sarah hesitated, poker still gripped tightly. It could be a ruse. But the desperation in the voice, it sounded genuine. Raw. And what real choice did she have? If this person meant harm, the simple wooden bar securing the door wouldn't deter them for long. If they were truly lost, leaving them outside was tantamount to murder. And maybe, just maybe, they could help. It was a sliver of hope, thin and fragile as new ice, but it was there, glimmering faintly in the darkness of her fear. "Who are you?" she called back, fighting to keep the tremor from her voice. "Traveler. Hunter. Name is Coda. Lost my way. Please, just need to wait out the storm." Coda. The name was unfamiliar. A hunter. That could mean supplies, skills. She took a deep breath, the frigid air stinging her lungs. "Are you alone?" "Yes. Alone." Another agonizing pause. She glanced at the sleeping twins, their vulnerability a physical ache in her chest. Could she risk opening the door? Could she risk not opening it? The last piece of the chair on the fire was slowly turning to glowing ash. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. All right, you can come in, but slowly. No sudden moves. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy wooden bar. The instant it cleared, the wind ripped the door inward with savage force, unleashing a blast of snow and freezing air that momentarily blinded her and extinguished the weaker flames in the hearth. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the swirling white maelstrom, stood a figure unlike any she had ever encountered up close. He was tall and powerfully built, bundled in thick furs and tanned hides crusted with ice. Snow coated his dark braided hair, which fell past his shoulders. His face, partially shadowed by a fur-trimmed hood, was striking. High cheekbones, a strong jawline etched by weather, skin the color of burnished copper. But it was his eyes that seized her attention. Dark, piercingly intense, and startlingly perceptive, they swept the cabin in a single swift glance, taking in the dying fire, the cradle, and Sarah herself, still clutching the poker defensively. He carried a long rifle, and a bow was slung across his back, alongside a quiver bristling with arrows fletched with hawk feathers. He looked wild, elemental, dangerous, and utterly out of place in her small, fragile, domestic world. He stepped inside quickly, using his shoulder to force the door shut against the storm's renewed assault. The sudden relative silence was almost deafening. He brushed snow from his furs with economical, precise movements. He didn't immediately crowd the hearth, but remained near the door, granting her space, though his sharp eyes missed nothing. Sarah noted the intriguing blend of features. The set of his cheekbones, the shape of his eyes suggested native heritage, likely Comanche, or Ute. Yet there was something in the line of his jaw, perhaps the slightly lighter weathered tone of his skin, that hinted at something else. Mixed blood, maybe. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space. He pulled back his hood slightly, revealing more of his face. It was younger than she first thought, perhaps late 20s, but marked by a maturity born of hardship. "Storm is bad. Very bad." Sarah swallowed hard, lowering the poker slightly but keeping it within reach. "You said your name is Coda?" Nodded curtly. "It is." He gestured vaguely towards the howling outside. "Was tracking elk. Storm came fast. Blew in from the north peaks like a devil. My horse. Lost him in a whiteout near the ridge. Got turned around. Blinded. Then I saw your smoke. A faint prayer." His explanation was concise, plausible. His presence, though undeniably intimidating, didn't radiate immediate menace. There was a bone-deep weariness in his posture, an undeniable relief at finding refuge from the blizzard's lethal embrace. "You live here alone?" he asked, his gaze drifting momentarily, respectfully towards the cradle. "My husband, he passed before the winter set in," Sarah explained, the familiar words still catching in her throat. "It's just me now, and the babies." A flicker of understanding, perhaps empathy, softened the intensity in his eyes. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Hard times." He unslung a heavy hide-wrapped pack from his back and carefully placed it on the floor near the door. "I have some dried meat, maybe some coffee grounds. Not much. Share fire?" The offer resonated, like a lifeline thrown into a freezing sea. Coffee, meat, shared warmth. It was more than she had dared to hope for just minutes before. "Yes," she breathed, the word thick with relief she couldn't conceal. "Yes, please. There's not much wood left." Coda's sharp gaze took in the pitifully small woodpile, then rested on the broken pieces of the chair nearby. A slight frown creased his brow. Without another word, he moved back to the door, braced himself against the inevitable blast, and pulled it open again, peering out into the white chaos. He stood there for a long moment, scanning the landscape obscured by the driving snow, his head tilted as if listening to something beyond the wind's roar, something only he could decipher. Then he closed and barred the door firmly. "There is deadfall pine not too far," he announced, his voice certain. "Sheltered by a rock overhang. Buried now, but I marked the place before the worst hit. Enough to last some days." He looked directly at her, his gaze steady. "I can bring some in, if you trust." Trust. The word hung heavy in the air. Trusting this stranger, this man who looked like the embodiment of the wildness outside, felt like a monumental leap of faith. But glancing at the dying embers, at the innocent sleeping faces of her children, she knew she had no real choice. This stranger, this hunter who spoke with the cadence of the Plains tribes yet used English words, Comanche, she suspected now, despite the subtle differences in his appearance, was their only chance. "All right," she said, meeting his direct gaze, forcing strength into her voice. "I trust." A fleeting expression, surprise, respect, crossed his face before settling back into its stoic lines. He nodded again, retrieved a small, wickedly sharp hatchet from his pack, unbarred the door and slipped out, letting the storm rage briefly, before vanishing almost instantly into the blinding white curtain. Sarah quickly rebarred the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had she made a terrible mistake, leaving her alone with the babies? But he had left his rifle, his pack, his bow. He intended to return. She fed the last piece of the broken chair to the flames, willing the fire, to hold to survive until he came back. The minutes crawled by, agonizingly slow. The wind seemed to mock her decision, whispering doubts, conjuring fears. Then, sooner than she had dared hope, came the solid, thudding knock again. She scrambled to unbar the door. Coda stumbled back. Inside, a snowman figure covered anew in thick powder, but his arms were laden with thick resinous pine branches, already expertly cut into manageable lengths. The sharp, clean scent of fresh pine filled the cabin, momentarily overpowering the smell of wood smoke and fear. He dropped the wood near the hearth with a satisfying thud that promised warmth, promised survival. "More out there," he said, his breathing slightly labored from the exertion. "Enough for a few days, maybe longer if we are careful." He didn't wait for thanks, but immediately knelt and began feeding the larger pieces into the grateful fire. Flames leaped up, licking at the fresh fuel, casting a warmer, more cheerful light around the small cabin, pushing back the oppressive shadows. Sarah watched him, a complex whirlwind of gratitude and lingering apprehension swirling within her. He moved with a quiet, ingrained confidence, his actions economical and purposeful. He seemed utterly at home in this harsh, unforgiving environment, unlike her, who felt like a fragile seedling struggling in hostile soil. He went back to his pack, opened it, and took out a sturdy deerskin pouch filled with strips of dark, dried meat, and another smaller pouch. "Jerky," he said, holding out the pouch towards her. "And coffee." Her stomach clenched violently with hunger at the sight and smell of the meat. She hadn't realized how ravenous she truly was. She took a piece, murmuring her thanks, her fingers clumsy with cold and eagerness. She chewed it slowly, savoring the tough, salty, smoky flavor. It was the most substantial food she'd tasted in what felt like an eternity. Coda took a piece for himself and then, producing a small, battered tin pot from his pack, began skillfully preparing coffee, setting the pot near the flames to heat. As the rich, earthy aroma of coffee began to fill the small space, a welcome counterpoint to the storm's howl, one of the twins, Ethan, stirred in the cradle and began to fuss, his cry thin and weak, lacking energy. Sarah immediately went to him, lifting him gently into her arms. He felt terrifyingly small, so fragile against the backdrop of the blizzard and their precarious situation. She tried to soothe him, rocking him gently, murmuring soft words, her heart aching with a familiar helplessness. His cries grew louder, more insistent, and soon his sister Emily woke and joined the hungry chorus. Coda watched them, his expression largely unreadable, yet hinting at a deep understanding. He poured the steaming coffee into 2 chipped enamel mugs he found on Sarah's rough-hewn shelf, carefully handing one to her. She accepted it gratefully, cupping her frozen fingers around its warmth. "They are hungry?" Coda asked quietly, stating the obvious but with gentle inquiry. Sarah nodded, tears finally welling up again, impossible to suppress this time. They spilled over, tracking hot paths down her cold cheeks. I don't have enough milk," she confessed, the words tumbling out, raw and desperate. "I haven't eaten enough myself. The food, it ran out days ago." Coda looked from the crying infants to Sarah's pale, tear-streaked face. He remained silent for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful, seemingly contemplating the situation. Then he reached back into the depths of his pack and carefully pulled out something wrapped in soft, supple hide. He unwrapped it to reveal a small, dense block of pemmican, the traditional high-energy mixture of dried, pounded meat, rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries. He broke off a tiny, fingernail-sized piece. "This is strong food," he said, his voice low. "Good fat, energy. Maybe help your milk?" He paused, hesitating slightly. "Or, very small piece, mixed with warm water. For babies? Very, very small." Sarah stared at the pemmican. She knew of it, a staple for native travelers and hunters, renowned for being incredibly nutrient-dense. The idea of feeding it directly to her newborns, however, was terrifying. Their tiny systems were so delicate. But her milk was undeniably failing. It was a choice between this unknown risk and the near certainty of starvation. "Let me try," Coda offered, gently sensing her hesitation. He took a minuscule scraping of the pemmican, mixed it carefully with a few drops of warm water from the kettle Sarah kept near the fire, creating a thin, slightly greasy paste. He dipped the very tip of his clean finger into the mixture and then, with surprising, incredible gentleness, touched it to Ethan's lips. The baby, startled by the contact and taste, stopped crying for a brief moment, his tiny mouth working instinctively. He seemed to taste it, then whimpered again, but less forcefully, perhaps confused but no longer escalating. Coda repeated the delicate process with Emily, who responded similarly, her cries subsiding into small, uncertain noises. It wasn't a meal, not by any means, but it seemed to quiet them slightly, perhaps offering a minuscule amount of sustenance or simply distracting them. Sarah looked at Coda, her eyes wide with a fragile, burgeoning trust that felt both terrifying and necessary. He wasn't just a hunter who had stumbled upon her cabin. He possessed a deep, practical knowledge of survival, an understanding of sustenance, on a level she couldn't comprehend. "Your people, you are Comanche?" she asked softly, finally voicing her suspicion aloud. He met her gaze steadily, without evasion. "My mother was Comanche, Willow Song of the Quahati Band. My father, why, he was a white trader, Robert McAllister. I walk between two worlds." He gestured briefly to himself. "Coda means little elk in my mother's tongue. Sometimes they call me Eagle Eye for my tracking. A half-breed." It explained the blend of features, his command of English alongside his obvious native skills, his presence hunting so far north, caught, perhaps perpetually, between the encroaching world of the settlers and the receding world of the plains, tribes. It also placed him in a potentially precarious position, distrusted perhaps by both sides. "Thank you, Coda," Sarah said, the words heartfelt, carrying the weight of her desperation and newfound hope. "For the wood, the food, for helping." He simply nodded, his gaze returning to the hypnotic dance of the flames, a flicker of some distant thought, some hidden burden, briefly visible in their depths. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, indifferent to the lives huddled within the small cabin. But inside, a fragile truce had been forged against the storm. Shared warmth, shared food, shared vulnerability. Sarah Mitchell, the grieving widow, and Coda, the Comanche hunter caught between worlds, waited together for the fury to pass, utterly unaware that the storm had irrevocably blown them onto a new, shared path, one that would alter the course of both their lives forever. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, imprisoning them in the snowbound cabin. Coda proved a quiet but profoundly reassuring presence. He kept the fire roaring, venturing out periodically into the white maelstrom to retrieve more dead wood, his uncanny ability to locate fuel beneath the deep drifts bordering on miraculous. To Sarah, he shared his remaining jerky and the precious pemmican sparingly, ensuring Sarah ate enough to potentially bolster her milk supply. He even spent hours patiently fashioning 2 pairs of rudimentary but functional snowshoes from bent willow branches gathered near the cabin and strips of hide cut from his own spare clothing, anticipating the arduous journey that lay ahead once the storm finally broke. He spoke little, seemingly comfortable in silence, but his actions communicated volumes. He showed Sarah how to bank the fire effectively at night to conserve precious wood, how to interpret the subtle shifts in the wind's pitch and howl that hinted at the storm's eventual weakening. Sarah, in turn, devoted her energy to caring for Ethan and Emily. Bolstered by the small regular portions of pemmican Coda insisted she eat, her milk seemed slightly more plentiful, enough to keep the babies reasonably content for longer stretches between their weak cries. She watched Coda, fascinated and still somewhat wary, but her fear was steadily being replaced by respect and a growing reliance. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that bespoke a life lived in intimate communion with the natural world. He would sit for long periods gazing into the fire, his thoughts seemingly miles away, perhaps with his people, perhaps contemplating their uncertain future. Sometimes his dark eyes would rest on her or the twins, not with menace or intrusion, but with a kind of quiet, assessing observation that made her feel strangely seen, yet acutely aware of the vast cultural gulf that separated their experiences. She learned fragments about his life, pieced together during brief conversations over coffee or while tending the fire. His white father, the trader, had died of cholera when Coda was just a boy. His Comanche mother, Willow Song, had raised him wholly among her people, teaching him their language, their complex social structure, their deep spiritual connection to the land, the buffalo, the changing seasons. He was Numunu, the people, in his heart, but he also carried his father's legacy, the English tongue, a familiarity with certain white customs, the slightly different cast to his features, which often set him apart, making him an outsider even among his own kin. He was a skilled hunter and tracker, respected for his abilities but always perceived as slightly other. "Why were you hunting so far north, Coda? So late in the season?" Sarah asked one evening, the firelight casting flickering amber highlights on his stoic face as he meticulously sharpened his hunting knife with a smooth river stone. He looked up, pausing his work. "My people's winter camp is far south this year," he explained, his voice low and steady. "Near the Red River breaks, but game has been scarce closer to the main camp. The drought last summer, it thinned the herds. Too many hunters maybe from different bands converging." I came further north, seeking a good supply of meat for my mother's lodge, maybe for others. Followed sign of a small elk herd deep into these mountains. He shrugged slightly, a gesture of acceptance towards forces beyond his control. Then the snow spirit woke in fury. His description, blending the poetic with the practical, highlighted the different lenses through which they viewed the world. To her, a catastrophic blizzard. To him, an awakened, powerful spirit. When the wind finally began to lose its demonic edge, eventually softening to intermittent gusts, replaced by an almost deafening silence and a sky bruised with the pale gray promise of clearing, Coda went to the door and peered out cautiously. The world was utterly transformed, reborn into a vast, undulating landscape of blinding white. The snow sculpted into enormous drifts and waves by the departed wind, dazzling under the weak, emerging sun. Drifts were piled higher than the cabin, roof in places a testament to the storm's ferocity. "Storm breaks," he announced, his voice quiet but firm. "But travel will be hard. The snow is deep, unpacked." He turned, his gaze meeting hers, then shifting to the twins, now awake and bundled near the fire. "Willow Creek is many days' walk from here. Maybe 10, maybe more through this." He shook his head slightly. "Too far, too dangerous. For them," he nodded towards the babies. "For you carrying little." Sarah's fragile, newly constructed hope plummeted. "But where can we go? We can't stay here. There's no food left. The pemmican is almost gone." Coda considered this, his gaze distant, scanning the white landscape beyond the cabin walls as if reading a map only he could see. "My people's winter camp, the main one. It is much closer than Willow Creek from here. Southeast." He calculated, silently for a moment. "Maybe 4 days' walk, maybe 5 if the weather holds and the snow settles some. With the deep snow, and carrying the little ones, it will be slow." Go with him? To a Comanche camp? The ingrained fear, nurtured by years of settler anxieties and campfire tales, surged back with suffocating force. Images of captivity, of unknown dangers, of a people she'd been implicitly taught to distrust, warred violently with the stark, undeniable reality of her situation. Stay here and surely starve or freeze or follow this near stranger, this man of two worlds, into a life utterly alien and potentially hostile? I don't know," she stammered, clutching her hands together. "Indians, settlers, there's so much trouble between—" "There is trouble," Coda agreed quietly, his face somber. "Always trouble when different people meet and fear instead of understand. But my mother's people, the Quahati band, they are led now by Chief Grey Wolf. He is stern, follows the old ways, but he is mostly just. And my mother, Willow Song, she is standing in the council. You would be under my protection, under her protection." He paused, his dark eyes locking with hers, compelling her to see the truth. "It is the only way, Sarah Mitchell. Stay here, you and the little ones. You will not survive the winter's end." He wasn't threatening her. He was stating a fact, brutal in its unadorned simplicity. She looked down at Ethan and Emily, now watching the dancing firelight with wide, innocent blue eyes. Their survival. That was the only thing that mattered. Her fear, her ingrained prejudices, her desperate longing for the familiar world she had lost with John, none of it weighed against their fragile lives. Coda had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared voice. He had saved them from the storm's immediate wrath. He had shared his meager food, his warmth, his skills. He had treated her and her vulnerable babies with a quiet, consistent respect. Could she trust him further? Could she trust his people? She realized with chilling clarity that she had no other viable choice. "All right, Coda," she said, her voice steadier than she felt inside. She met his gaze directly. "We'll go with you, to your mother's camp." A flicker of relief quickly masked across his features. "Good. We prepare now. Leave when the sun is highest tomorrow. Need strong light to read the snow-break trail." The preparations were swift and efficient under Coda's focused direction. He used the snowshoes he'd made to pack down a firm trail leading away from the cabin, testing the depth and consistency of the immense snowdrifts, planning their initial route. He helped Sarah bundle the twins with painstaking care, wrapping them in every available blanket and scrap of wool, creating warm cocoons, then securing them firmly but gently into the sturdy cradle John had built. Coda then ingeniously rigged strong straps using braided strips of hide, transforming the cradle into a remarkably stable pack that could be carried securely on his broad back, ensuring the babies were protected from the worst of the wind and cold. Sarah gathered their few remaining essentials: the battered coffee pot, the 2 mugs, the last crumbs of pemmican, her husband's spare hunting knife, the tattered quilt that held his scent, into a bundle she could manage. Coda retrieved his rifle and bow, checked his arrows, his movements economical and filled with purpose. As the sun reached its zenith the following day, casting long, stark blue shadows across the dazzling, unbroken expanse of white, they stood, ready. Sarah took one last lingering look around the small log cabin. It had been her home, her prison, the place where she had loved John with fierce devotion, birthed their children, and faced utter despair. Against the vast, indifferent backdrop of snow-covered mountains, it looked impossibly small, fragile, and forlorn. Taking a deep, steadying breath, the cold air biting her lungs, she stepped out, following Coda onto the packed trail he had forged, leaving the cabin and her old life behind her, stepping into an unknown future. The journey was grueling, more physically and emotionally demanding than Sarah could have ever imagined. The snow, breathtakingly beautiful in its vast untouched purity, was also treacherous and exhausting. Even with Coda breaking trail ahead on his snowshoes, each step Sarah took sank deep, requiring immense effort to pull free. The cold was relentless, biting through her worn layers of clothing despite the weak winter sunshine. Coda moved steadily ahead, the cradle pack surprisingly stable on his back, his long, even strides eating up the miles. He paused frequently, without complaint, allowing Sarah to catch her breath, always checking on the twins who, cocooned in warmth and lulled by the rhythmic motion, mostly slept. He navigated by subtle landmarks Sarah couldn't discern: the specific shape of a distant snow-laden ridge, the distinct lean of a wind-battered pine, the almost imperceptible contours of the snow-covered land beneath their feet. He pointed out animal tracks crisscrossing the white canvas: rabbit, fox, a lone coyote, showing her how to read the silent stories written in the snow, explaining their significance. He was patient, explaining things in his simple, direct English, occasionally using a Comanche word: pia, mother, ekusi, sun, tosa, white, that Sarah tried hard to memorize, grasping for purchase in this new reality. Nights were spent huddled under makeshift shelters Coda constructed with remarkable speed and skill, using fallen pine boughs and stretched hides against rock outcroppings, or within dense thickets of frozen aspen, offering minimal but vital protection from the wind and plummeting temperatures. He would build a small, incredibly efficient fire that provided warmth with minimal smoke, share morsels of the last jerky and pemmican, melt snow for water, and then stand watch, a silent guardian, while Sarah and the babies slept fitfully, huddled together under the quilt. Despite the profound hardship, the constant ache in her muscles, the gnawing uncertainty. A strange sense of security began to bloom within Sarah. Coda's competence was absolute, unquestionable. He was attuned to the wilderness in a way that made the terrifying landscape seem less hostile, somehow manageable, knowable. He was her guide, her protector, the sole barrier between her small, fragile family and the indifferent cruelty of nature. On the fourth day, the terrain began to change noticeably. They descended gradually from the high windswept peaks into rolling foothills, dotted with clusters of juniper and bare-branched cottonwoods lining the frozen, meandering paths of creek beds. Coda became even more watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his posture subtly shifting, growing more alert. "We are close," he announced late in the afternoon, his voice low. "The winter camp is just beyond that next ridge." Sarah's anxiety, which had receded somewhat during the physical demands of the journey, returned with a vengeance, knotting her stomach. What awaited them there? Curiosity? Suspicion? Outright hostility? How would these people react to a lone, white woman and her twin babies appearing in their midst, escorted by one of their own who walked between worlds? As they finally crested the last ridge, Sarah stopped, catching her breath, not just from exertion but from the sight below. Nestled in a wide, sheltered valley carved by an ice-fringed river, lay the Comanche winter camp. It was larger than she had envisioned, a scattered collection of perhaps 50 or 60 conical lodges, teepees, smoke curling lazily from their apexes into the cold, still air. Hardy plains ponies, their coats thick against the chill, pawed at the snow near a makeshift brush corral searching for buried winter grass. Figures moved among the lodges, women wrapped in blankets tending outdoor fires, children darting about in energetic games involving sliding on the river ice, men returning from hunting expeditions, their figures dark silhouettes against the vast white backdrop. The faint sounds drifted up to them on the cold air, the murmur of voices in a language she didn't understand, the occasional sharp cry or shout, the barking of numerous camp dogs, the whinny of a horse, the collective sounds of a community, alive and functioning, thriving even, in the heart of winter. Coda paused beside her, allowing her a moment to take it all in. "Numanu," he said softly, the word carrying a weight of belonging and identity. "The people, my mother's people." He started down the slope, his strides sure-footed on the packed snow. Sarah followed hesitantly, clutching her meager bundle tighter, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. As they drew nearer, activity in the camp began to slow. Heads turned, conversations paused, faces turned towards them, dark, eyes curious, watchful, their expressions largely unreadable but undeniably intense. Children stopped their play to stare openly, pointing. Camp dogs set up a chorus of barking, announcing their arrival more effectively than any trumpet. Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable like an insect under scrutiny. She focused on Coda's broad back, drawing a measure of strength from his steady, unwavering presence. He led her directly towards one of the larger, well-maintained teepees situated near the center of the encampment. As they approached, the hide flap covering the entrance was pushed aside and an older woman emerged, alerted by the commotion. She was tall and remarkably wiry, her face a fascinating network of fine lines etched by decades of sun and wind and wisdom, her long gray hair neatly parted and braided, interwoven with strips of otter fur. Her eyes, dark and piercingly sharp, like Coda's, swept over Sarah and the cradle pack on Coda's back, then settled on Coda himself with an expression that mingled relieved affection with questioning concern. She wore leggings and a tunic of finely tanned, smoked deer hide, adorned with intricate, colorful beadwork that spoke of skill and status. Coda, Piabia, "My son," she said, her voice melodic despite its carrying power, resonant with an unmistakable air of authority. She spoke in Comanche, but her penetrating gaze on Sarah required no translation. "Who is this? Why is she here?" Coda responded rapidly to her in their shared tongue, gesturing towards Sarah, the cradle, and then back towards the snow-covered mountains from which they had emerged. His tone was respectful but firm, explaining their circumstances. The woman, Willow Song, Sarah presumed, listened intently, her expression shifting from initial surprise to deep contemplation, her sharp eyes assessing Sarah with an unnerving, stripping intensity. Sarah stood awkwardly, shifting her weight, feeling utterly exposed and vulnerable, unable to understand the words but acutely aware that her fate, and that of her children, was being decided in this rapid guttural exchange. Finally, Willow Song looked directly at Sarah. She spoke a few crisp words in Comanche, then looked expectantly at Coda. He turned slightly towards Sarah to translate. "My mother, Willow Song, bids you welcome to her fire. She asks why you have come to our camp." Sarah took a shaky breath, trying to steady her nerves. "My husband died," she began, her voice trembling despite her efforts. "I was alone with the baby when the great blizzard hit. Our food, our firewood, it was gone. We were freezing. Coda found us. He saved our lives. He told me this was the only place we might survive." Coda translated her words faithfully. Willow Song listened without interruption, her weathered face impassive, revealing nothing of her thoughts. She looked again at the cradle pack secured to Coda's back, then back at Sarah's pale, earnest face. There was a long, heavy silence, broken only by the crackling of a nearby cooking fire and the distant, carefree sound of children's laughter. Sarah held her breath, her future hanging precariously in the balance of this elder woman's judgment. Then, Willow Song spoke again, a longer statement this time, her tone seeming slightly softer, more measured. Coda turned back to Sarah, a subtle easing of tension visible around his own eyes. "My mother says the storm spirit tests us all in its season. She says the great spirit sometimes works in ways we do not easily understand. She sees you carry much sorrow, but she also sees strength in your eyes. She sees the little ones are innocent and have suffered. You are welcome to shelter in her lodge. You and your children will be safe here under her protection, as long as you respect our ways." Tears of sheer, unadulterated relief welled instantly in Sarah's eyes, blurring the sight of the camp around her. She could barely manage a choked, "Thank you," before emotion overwhelmed her. Willow Song simply gave a single, grave nod, her gaze lingering on the cradle pack where the twins were now beginning to stir and let out small, tentative whimpers. She gestured towards the entrance of her teepee. "Come," Coda said gently, placing a steadying hand lightly on Sarah's arm. "Come, inside, rest now, you are safe." He carefully unstrapped the cradle pack, lowering it gently onto a patch of snow-cleared ground near the teepee entrance. Willow Song bent down, her stern face softening remarkably as she peered at the two tiny blinking faces revealed when Coda loosened the protective blankets. A low murmur, soft and filled with undisguised wonder, escaped her lips as she saw the identical pair. She looked up sharply at Sarah, then back at the babies, a flicker of something akin to awe entering her ancient eyes. Twins, Ohatuhuya, were rare among the people, often considered spiritually significant, a powerful medicine, a special blessing, or sometimes a challenging omen. Perhaps their unexpected arrival heralded something important. Willow Song beckoned them inside. Ducking through the low, hide-covered entrance flap, Sarah stepped out of the biting wind and into a world utterly different from her small, cold cabin. The air inside the teepee was surprisingly warm and thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, roasting meat, aromatic sage, and tanned hides. Thick buffalo robes covered the packed earth floor, providing insulation and comfort. Woven willow backrests leaned against the lodge poles and various painted parfleche bags. Bundles of herbs, tools, and weapons hung neatly from the structure. A bright fire burned efficiently in a shallow pit in the center, the smoke rising cleanly through the adjustable opening at the teepee's apex. It felt unexpectedly spacious, secure, and possessed a strange, encompassing intimacy. Willow Song gestured for Sarah to sit on a thick, soft robe near the fire, then immediately turned, her attention to the fussing babies. With surprisingly nimble and gentle hands, she helped Coda lift Ethan and Emily from the cradle, clucking softly in Comanche as she examined their tiny forms, checking their warmth, murmuring soothing, unfamiliar sounds. Coda spoke quietly to his mother, likely explaining the extent of their near starvation. Willow Song nodded gravely, then issued quiet instructions in Comanche. A younger woman, perhaps a relative helping in the lodge who had been quietly working on some beadwork in the corner, quickly rose and brought warm, nourishing broth in a polished horn cup. Following Willow Song's clear gestures, Sarah understood. She was to drink the broth first. It was rich, savory, and deeply warming, seeping into her chilled bones, calming her trembling. Then Willow Song took a clean, soft piece of doeskin, dipped a corner into the broth, and with infinite patience, gently touched it to Ethan's lips, letting him instinctively suckle the moisture and vital nutrients. She did the same for Emily. It was a slow, painstaking process, but the babies seemed to respond almost immediately, their weak cries quieting into soft, contented gurgles. Watching Willow Song's expert, gentle ministrations, a profound wave of exhaustion washed over Sarah, heavier than any snowdrift. The days of terror, the grueling journey, the constant gnawing fear. It all caught up with her in that moment of safety. She leaned back gratefully against the offered willow backrest, the encompassing warmth of the fire and the unexpected, undemanding kindness making her dizzy with relief. Coda settled nearby, speaking quietly with his mother in their fluid language. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the tone was calm, reassuring. She was here. She was safe. Her babies were warm and being cared for. For the first time since John's sudden, devastating death months ago, Sarah allowed herself to truly rest, drifting almost instantly into a deep, dreamless sleep in the smoky warmth of the Comanche lodge, guarded by the unlikely pair of a half-Comanche hunter and his wise, watchful mother. The path ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty, fraught with challenges she couldn't yet comprehend. But for now, against all odds, they had found sanctuary. Life in the Comanche winter camp unfolded with the steady, natural rhythm of the season, a pattern dictated by the needs of the community, the availability of game, and the constraints imposed by cold and snow. Sarah, initially confined mostly to the comforting warmth of Willow Song's spacious lodge while she regained her strength and focused on nursing the twins back to health, slowly began to observe and absorb the intricate tapestry of this new world. It was a life lived close to the bone, intensely practical and deeply intertwined with the surrounding environment, yet rich with complex social structures, ingrained traditions, and a pervasive spirituality that seemed to inform even the most mundane daily activities. Willow Song proved to be a patient, if occasionally stern and demanding teacher. Though her English was virtually non-existent, and Sarah's Comanche vocabulary grew slowly, limited initially to the essential words Coda taught her: ta, hello, yes, k, no, ura, thank you, basic names for food, objects, and people. They developed a surprisingly effective form of communication built on gestures, expressive tones, and the shared language of domestic tasks. Willow Song demonstrated how to properly scrape and prepare buffalo and deer hides for tanning. Physically grueling work that left Sarah's unused muscles aching, but provided a tangible sense of contribution and worth. She patiently guided Sarah's clumsy fingers through the rudiments of beadwork, her own nimble digits creating intricate geometric patterns on scraps of leather with practiced ease. She showed Sarah how to grind dried berries, roots, and corn into meal using smooth stones, how to mix ingredients for pemmican, how to mend worn moccasins using a sharp bone awl and tough sinew thread, how to distinguish between different types of firewood for their specific burning properties, cottonwood for quick heat, oak for long-lasting coals. Acceptance by the wider tribe came gradually, cautiously. Sarah remained an anomaly, a Tosa Equi, white woman, living among them, not as a captive taken in a raid, but as a guest under the explicit protection of Willow Song and Coda. There were many curious glances, whispered conversations just beyond, her hearing that ceased when she looked up, and a certain polite distance maintained by many of the adults. The children, however, were less inhibited by protocol and prejudice. Drawn by the sheer novelty of the white babies with their fair skin and wisps of light-colored hair, they would often peek shyly into Willow Song's lodge, their dark eyes wide with unconcealed fascination. Sarah, remembering her own profound loneliness in the cabin, made a point of offering them small, tentative smiles. Gradually, some of the bolder ones would edge closer, eventually daring to touch Ethan's or Emily's hands, giggling at the contrast with their own skin. Coda acted as an essential bridge between Sarah's world and that of the people. He spent much of his time hunting, his skills crucial for providing fresh meat not just for his mother's lodge, but often shared generously with other families according to custom, reinforcing his value and status within the tribe. When he was in camp, he would often sit with Sarah near the fire, patiently translating snippets of conversation, explaining complex customs and kinship rules, answering her endless stream of questions about their beliefs and way of life. He told her about the structure of the tribe, the different bands and their leaders, the distinct roles of the peace chiefs like Grey Wolf, the war leaders, the powerful medicine men and women. He explained their deep reverence for the buffalo, which provided food, shelter, clothing, and tools, their respect for the eagle, the bear, and the subtle forces of nature they perceived as imbued with living spirit. Grey Wolf leads the main council, Coda explained one evening, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the hide walls of the teepee. The twins sleeping soundly nearby in a new cradle Willow Song had skillfully fashioned from willow rods and lined with incredibly soft rabbit fur. He follows the old ways, the path of our fathers. He believes we must keep separate from the Tosa Tuhuyakai, white man's path, avoid their reservations and their lies. Then there is another leader, Standing Bear. Younger perhaps sees the world changing. He thinks, maybe there is a way to live alongside the whites, trade with them, perhaps learn some new ways without losing who we are, Numunu. There is much talk around the fires, much disagreement. Sarah listened intently, absorbing the information. The divisions Coda spoke of, the uncertainty about the future, mirrored the turbulence she felt within herself. Could two vastly different cultures with such a history of conflict and misunderstanding truly coexist? Her relationship with Coda deepened, evolving organically from dependence and gratitude into a genuine trusting friendship built on mutual respect and shared experience. They talked for hours during the long winter evenings, sharing more about their pasts, her life with John on their small farm back east, their dreams of building a life in Colorado, the raw, still aching grief of his sudden loss, his life spent navigating two disparate identities, the powerful pull of his mother's people versus the persistent, sometimes painful echoes of his white father's world. He confessed his own form of loneliness, the pervasive feeling of never fully belonging in either world. Here, he gestured around the warm, smoky teepee. I am Numunu, Comanche. My heart is Comanche, but my skin, my father's name and blood, it always sets me apart, even here, in the white towns. He shook his head, a shadow crossing his face. I am just Indian, an outcast, sometimes dangerous, sometimes pitied, never truly accepted. Sarah understood that feeling of being an outsider perhaps better than anyone else in the camp. Here, she was the Tosa Equi, different, alien. She recognized the shared space of their in-betweenness, their mutual experience of straddling worlds. She came to admire his quiet resilience, his profound knowledge of the natural world that sustained them, his unexpected gentleness, especially with her children. He, in turn, seemed to respect her fierce devotion to the twins, her quiet determination to adapt and learn, her resilience in the face of devastating loss. A subtle awareness, an unspoken tenderness grew between them, palpable in shared glances across the flickering fire, in the easy, comfortable silences that sometimes fell between them, more eloquent than words. Willowsong observed this growing connection with her wise, knowing eyes but made no direct comment. She continued to guide Sarah in the ways of Comanche womanhood, her usually stern demeanor occasionally softening into a rare, brief smile, particularly when interacting with the twins whom she had taken to calling Tasupaku, little whites with a gruff, undeniable affection. She seemed to recognize, perhaps even accept, the unique bond forming between her son, the man caught between worlds, and the white woman he had rescued from the storm, accepting it with the same pragmatic stoicism with which she accepted the harshness of winter and the uncertainty of the future. As the weeks melted away and the deep snows finally began their slow, grudging retreat under the strengthening sun, revealing patches of pale, dormant grass on the valley floor, life in the camp quickened. Hunting parties ventured out more frequently, returning with much-needed deer and antelope. Discussions around the council fires intensified. Plans were being made for the traditional move to spring hunting grounds further out on the plains. Sarah, now physically stronger, healthier, and more integrated into the daily rhythms of the camp, felt a strange, conflicting mix of belonging and persistent unease. She was safe. She was cared for. She was learning invaluable skills for survival. Ethan and Emily were thriving, growing chubby and alert on a diet supplemented by Willowsong's nourishing broths and Sarah's own returning health and milk supply. Yet, she was still Sarah Mitchell, the white settler's widow. Was this her life now? Could it truly be? The question lingered, unanswered. The arrival of spring brought not just warmer weather and the greening of the land, but also unforeseen complications that shattered the relative peace of the winter encampment. A small group of warriors returned from a long scouting mission, bearing unsettling news. Increased U.S. Army patrols sighted to the south and west, more numerous and aggressive than usual. Uneasy whispers circulated through the camp. Talk of treaties recently broken by the government, of other tribes being forcibly relocated, of the relentless push to confine all Plains Indians onto reservations in the barren Indian territories far to the south. The familiar, simmering tension between the settlers and the native tribes felt suddenly much closer, more immediate, more threatening. Around the same time, a different kind of intrusion occurred, one more personal and potentially disruptive for Sarah. A lone white man rode boldly into the valley, not blunderingly like a lost traveler, but purposefully, following tracks Sarah realized with a sudden jolt must have been theirs. preserved under the snow since their desperate journey from the cabin months before. He was a burly man with a thick, unkempt beard and shrewd, calculating eyes, dressed in the worn canvas and leather typical of prospectors or traders. He reined in his horse at the edge of the camp near Willow Song's lodge, his gaze sweeping dismissively over the teepees and their inhabitants before calling out Koda's name with rough familiarity. Koda emerged from the teepee, his posture instantly wary, his hand resting lightly near the knife at his belt. Sarah watched from just inside the entrance flap, her stomach tightening with a familiar knot of apprehension. After a brief, tense conversation conducted in low tones, Koda turned and led the man towards the teepee. "Sarah Mitchell," Koda said, his voice carefully neutral, though Sarah detected an underlying tension. "This is Marshal Jensen. He says he knew your husband, John, from Willow Creek." Sarah stared at the newcomer, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Jensen." The name sparked a vague flicker of recognition. John had mentioned him once or twice. A trader, sometimes prospector, known for being sharp, perhaps a little too sharp, in his dealings. A man John hadn't entirely trusted. Jensen swept off his dusty hat, revealing thinning sandy hair plastered to his scalp. He gave Sarah a look that seemed to mix cursory pity with something else, something unpleasantly proprietary. "Mrs. Mitchell? Well, I'll be. Heard tell you and the little ones was lost out near the Blue River Basin after John. Well, after he passed on." His eyes darted around the Comanche camp, taking in the details with ill-disguised disdain. "Folks back in Willow Creek had given you up for dead, perished in that terrible blizzard. Imagine my surprise-cutting sign leading this way, clear as day once the melt started." He lowered his voice, leaning closer conspiratorially. "Seems you found some, unlikely rescuers, Mr. Jensen," Sarah said coolly, instinctively disliking his tone and the way his eyes lingered on her, assessing her as if she were property. "Koda and his mother saved my life and the lives of my children. I owe them everything." "Right noble of 'em, I suppose," Jensen conceded grudgingly, though his voice lacked any genuine conviction. "Look, Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah, it ain't right. You bein' here, a decent white woman, alone with babies living amongst them." He gestured vaguely at the camp. He lowered his voice again, glancing around nervously. "Fact is, I came to take you back. Back to Willow Creek. Back where you belong. John surely would have wanted that for his wife and young'uns." The offer hung in the still spring air. Willow Creek. Civilization such as it was. People who looked like her spoke her language. A chance to return to the life she'd known, or at least some semblance of it. A part of her, the part that still grieved deeply for John and often felt perpetually out of place in this Comanche world. Yearned for the familiar, for the perceived safety of her own kind. But looking at Jensen, with his condescending attitude towards the people who had shown her profound kindness and saved her from certain death, listening to his arrogant assumption about where she belonged, she felt a surprising, powerful surge of resistance rise within her. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Jensen," she said carefully, choosing her words, "and for making the journey. But I am safe here for the time being. I need more time to recover. To think." Jensen frowned, clearly taken aback by her lack of immediate gratitude and acceptance. "Time? Sarah, for pity's sake, look around. These ain't your people. Besides, there's serious trouble brewing. Heard it downriver myself. The army's moving south, big patrols. They aim to push all these tribes onto reservations down in the territories before summer's out. This ain't gonna be a safe place for you or those little ones for much longer." You come back with me now while you still got the chance." His words, intended to frighten her into compliance, struck a different, deeper chord. The army, reservations, the very danger Coda had spoken of, the tension she had felt growing in the camp. If the tribe was forced to move south, possibly facing conflict along the way, where did that leave her and the twins? Could she subject her children to that kind of perilous journey, that uncertain hunted future? Jensen, for all his unpleasantness and prejudice, offered a path back to supposed safety, back to the world John had originally intended for them, away from the looming conflict. "I need to speak with Coda," Sarah said firmly, avoiding Jensen's insistent gaze. "And with Willowsong. This decision, it affects them too. They saved us." Jensen looked profoundly irritated, but seemed to recognize that pushing her further at that moment would be counterproductive. "All right, have it your way. I'll make camp nearby tonight, down by the creek. Give you till morning to see sense. But don't be a fool, Sarah. Think of those babies. Think of what your husband John would expect of you." He jammed his hat back on his head, tipped it curtly, and strode back towards his waiting horse, casting wary, hostile glances at the silent Comanche warriors who had gathered nearby, watching the exchange with impassive faces. That evening, the atmosphere inside Willowsong's lodge was thick with unspoken tension. Sarah explained Jensen's offer and his warnings, Coda translating quietly and accurately for his mother. Willowsong listened without comment, her dark eyes fixed on the hypnotic flames in the central fire pit, her lined face unreadable. Coda remained quiet for a long time after Sarah finished speaking, his own face drawn and somber. "Jensen, speak some truth, Sarah," Coda said finally, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was low, grave. "The soldiers, Tuhuya Kai Kutsunaku, white soldiers, they gather like storm clouds to the south. Grey Wolf wants to take all the Quahati. Band south, join with other Comanche, maybe Kiowa too. Preserve the old ways. Fight if need be. Hide in the Llano Estacado." Standing Bear. He argues for a different path. He thinks we should try to stay near here, near this valley, our ancestral land along the creek the whites call Willow. Ask the Tekwuniwapu, agent for a small piece of land. Try to live peaceably beside the settlement, trade, maybe even learn their farming ways while holding on to ours. The council is deeply divided. Soon a choice must be made. A path must be chosen. Sarah looked from Coda's troubled face to Willowsong's stoic profile. Jensen's unwelcome arrival had forced a crisis, bringing all the underlying anxieties and divisions bubbling to the surface. Her personal choice, to return to the white world or stay, was now inextricably intertwined with the tribe's uncertain future, with their very survival. Go back with Jensen to the familiar, prejudiced, but potentially safer world of Willow Creek, or cast her lot entirely with these people, follow Coda and Willowsong, face the dangers of flight and conflict, or the challenges of an uneasy, uncertain coexistence. "What will you do, Coda?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. "If the tribe splits?" He looked at her then, his dark eyes searching hers, holding an intensity that made her breath catch. "My mother. She is old now. The journey south, the running, the fighting. It would be too hard for her." He glanced towards Willowsong, who continued to gaze into the fire, yet Sarah knew she was listening intently. Standing Bear's way. "It is risky, maybe foolish, relying on white promises." He shook his head slightly. "But maybe it is the only way to keep some part of this land, our home, for our children." He hesitated, Then his voice gained a quiet intensity, raw, with unspoken emotion. My place is here, Sarah. With my mother. With Standing Bear, with you, if you will stay. The unspoken emotion that had simmered between them for months, nurtured by shared hardship and growing affection, was suddenly laid bare in the firelight. It wasn't just about protection or friendship or gratitude anymore. It was about a shared future, a commitment offered amidst profound uncertainty and looming danger. He was asking her to choose not just a place, but a person, a life bound inextricably to his. Willow Song looked up sharply, her gaze moving from her son to Sarah. She spoke briefly, softly, in Comanche, her words carrying the weight of maternal wisdom. Coda translated, a faint flush rising on his high cheekbones. My mother says, a man must choose his path according to his duty and his vision. A woman must choose hers according to her heart. She says, she would welcome you as a daughter, Pia Tuekwi, daughter-in-law, if your heart truly stays here with us. Sarah's own heart felt tight, constricted in her chest. Jensen represented the past, a return to what was known, however flawed and prejudiced it might be. Coda represented the unknown, a future woven into the fabric of a different people, a different way of life, fraught with peril, but also offering a deep connection, a profound love she hadn't thought possible after John. She looked at her sleeping twins, their innocent faces peaceful in the firelight, their futures hanging precariously in the balance of her decision. What life was truly best for them? A life potentially marked by poverty and prejudice in the white world, seen as the children of a widow forced to rely on charity? Or a life integrated into Coda's world, facing different, perhaps even greater dangers, but also belonging, loved, part of a strong family, a resilient community? She thought of John, his strength, his dreams for carving a life from this land. He had respected the Comanche's resilience, their deep connection to the earth he had sought to tame. Would he truly want her to run back to the stifling conformity and judgment of Willow Creek, abandoning the man who had selflessly saved his family? She thought of Coda's quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, his gentle care for her and the babies, the profound understanding that often passed between them without the need for words. She thought of Willow Song's fierce protective guidance, her patient teaching. Despite its alienness, this felt more like home now, more real than the distant memory of Willow Creek. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, she met Coda's waiting, hopeful gaze across the fire. My heart stays here, Coda, she said, her voice clear and certain, infused with a conviction that surprised even herself. With you, with Willow Song, with the people. Whatever path you choose, whatever challenges come, we will walk it together. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Coda's face, illuminating his features, chasing away the shadows of worry. Willow Song nodded once, a look of deep, quiet satisfaction settling in her ancient eyes. The decision was made. When Marshal Jensen rode back to their camp the next morning, expecting Sarah to have come to her senses, she met him outside the lodge, Coda standing silently but solidly beside her. She politely but firmly declined his offer, explaining that her place, her future, was now here with Coda's people. Jensen argued, blustered, warned her she was making a terrible, life-ruining mistake, that she'd regret turning her back on her own kind. But seeing her quiet resolve, feeling the unwavering presence of Coda, and perhaps sensing the silent, watchful attention of several other Comanche warriors standing nearby, he finally gave up in disgust. Muttering curses about stubborn women and savages, he swung onto his horse and rode away, back towards the white world, leaving Sarah to face her chosen future in the heart of the Comanche Nation. The council meeting that followed was held under the vast, impossibly blue Colorado sky. The chiefs and elder warriors of the Quahati band gathered in a solemn circle near the riverbank. Gray Wolf, his weathered face grim, his eyes reflecting the harsh realities they faced, argued passionately for moving south immediately, joining with other Comanche and Kiowa bands, preserving their traditional nomadic way of life far from the encroaching settlements and the imminent threat of the U.S. Army. He spoke of treaties broken like dry twigs, of ancestral lands stolen, of the sacred buffalo being slaughtered towards extinction, of the urgent need to resist assimilation or be extinguished as a people. His powerful words resonated deeply with many, especially the younger warriors restless under the constraints of the winter camp and eager to prove their bravery against the white invaders. Then Standing Bear rose to speak. His voice was quieter, more measured, lacking Gray Wolf's fiery oratory, but it held a different kind of strength, a thoughtful deliberation. He acknowledged the dangers, the profound injustices they had suffered, but he argued that running south was perhaps only delaying the inevitable confrontation, trading one set of dangers for another in the already overcrowded Indian territories. He proposed a different, more radical path. Stay here, near their ancestral lands along Willow Creek, the place the spirits knew. Approach the white authorities, the agent, the soldiers, the settlers themselves. Petition formally for a small, recognized piece of land to live on peaceably. Learn to trade more effectively, perhaps even adapt some farming techniques alongside their hunting. Find a way to survive through coexistence, not perpetual conflict or flight. It was a deeply controversial idea, fraught with immense risk, relying heavily on the dubious goodwill and inconsistent policies of the very people who threatened their existence. The debate was long, impassioned, and intense. Loyalties were torn. Families faced the agonizing prospect of separation. In the end, no consensus could be reached. The tribe, with heavy hearts, agreed to the painful necessity of splitting. Gray Wolf would lead those who wished to follow the old path south, seeking refuge and perhaps finding a space for resistance in the vastness of the southern plains and the supposed sanctuary of the designated Indian territories. Standing Bear would lead a smaller, more vulnerable group, including Willow Song and Coda, who chose the precarious gamble of remaining, attempting to forge a new kind of existence near Willow Creek. The parting was deeply emotional, tearing at the fabric of the community. Families were divided, lifelong bonds strained. Tears were shed openly. Solemn farewells exchanged between people who had lived their entire lives together, sharing hunts, ceremonies, sorrows, and joys. Sarah watched, her own heart heavy, understanding the magnitude of the sacrifice being made, the profound uncertainty both groups now faced. As Gray Wolf's band prepared their travois and ponies for the long journey south, the old chief approached Coda and Sarah. He looked intently at Sarah, his piercing gaze seeming to see right through her, then glanced at the twins she held close, one in each arm. "The white woman chooses a hard path," he said gravely, Coda translating his Comanche words. "The spirits watch all paths. May your courage be as strong as the mountain rock." He nodded curtly to Coda. "Guard your family well, Eagle Eye. The future is a shifting stream, easily muddied." Then, without another word, he turned, mounted his pony, and led his people south, their figures slowly shrinking against the vast horizon, leaving Standing Bear's diminished group to face their uncertain future alone in the valley. Standing Bear's group, numbering perhaps 20 lodges in total, moved their camp closer to the river valley near the settlement of Willow Creek, establishing a modest, temporary encampment in a secluded cottonwood grove downstream. It was a deliberate statement of Intent. They were not hiding, but they were also not directly confronting the nearby settlement, choosing a space that allowed for both separation and potential interaction. The first, most critical task was immediate survival. Hunting, gathering edible plants as the spring progressed, reinforcing their lodges, preparing for the coming seasons as a smaller, more self-reliant community. The second, far more delicate, task was establishing some form of contact, hopefully peaceful, with the inhabitants of Willow Creek. Standing Bear, accompanied by Coda, whose fluent English and familiarity with white customs were now invaluable assets, and a few other chosen representatives, made the first cautious overtures. They approached the outskirts of the small settlement, not carrying weapons openly, not in traditional paint, but with gestures of peace, offering prime tanned hides and intricately beaded items for trade. The reaction in Willow Creek was predictably mixed. Fear and deep-seated suspicion, ingrained over years of conflict, rumor, and mutual misunderstanding, were palpable. Some of the more hostile settlers wanted nothing to do with the savages, advocating for driving them out immediately. Others, perhaps remembering John Mitchell's more respectful attitude or simply being pragmatic about their own needs, saw potential benefits in trade. Henderson, the practical, no-nonsense storekeeper, proved willing to barter essential goods, flour, salt, coffee, metal tools, for valuable hides and well-made Comanche crafts. The town blacksmith, a gruff man named Jebediah, grudgingly agreed to repair metal tools or arrowheads for a fair price in hides or jerky. A slow, extremely tentative relationship began to form, characterized by pervasive distrust on both sides, but nonetheless offering a fragile glimmer of hope for peaceful coexistence. For Sarah and Coda, this period was focused on building their own future together, bridging their two worlds in a very personal way. With the help of several people from Standing Bear's group, they returned to Sarah's abandoned log cabin. It was a strange, emotionally charged experience for Sarah to be back, the poignant ghosts of her past life with John, mingling uncomfortably with the tangible reality of her present with Coda. The cabin felt small, almost claustrophobic after the airy spaciousness of Willow Song's teepee, but it was solid shelter, a place with foundations, a potential anchor for their new blended life. Coda, proving as skilled with an axe and hammer as he was with a bow, worked tirelessly to repair the damage inflicted by the harsh winter and subsequent neglect, reinforcing the walls, patching the roof with new shakes, making the small structure secure and weatherproof once more. Sarah worked diligently alongside him, rechinking the logs with mud and grass, scrubbing the floors, slowly turning the small, rough structure back into a home, their home. Willow Song often came to help, bringing bundles of herbs for cooking and medicine, showing Sarah how to break ground for a small garden plot near the cabin, planting the precious corn, bean, and squash seeds she had carefully saved, the three sisters of sustainable native agriculture. Living and working side by side, day after demanding day, cemented the deep bond between Sarah and Coda. The unspoken affection that had blossomed in the teepee now bloomed into open tenderness and quiet devotion. They learned each other's rhythms completely, anticipated each other's needs without words, found profound comfort in shared silence as much as in easy conversation. One warm evening, sitting together on a rough bench Coda had built outside the repaired cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in breathtaking hues of orange, pink, and purple, Coda turned to Sarah, taking her work-roughened hand gently in his. His touch sent a familiar, comforting warmth through her. "Sarah Mitchell," he began, his voice low and earnest, his dark eyes holding hers. "We have walked a hard path together since the storm spirit brought us to the same fire. We build a home here now, together, between two worlds, your world and mine." He paused, glancing towards the cabin where the twins were sleeping. "My mother calls you daughter. Ethan and Emily. They look at me. They learn my words alongside yours." He hesitated, searching for the right English phrasing for the deep emotion in his heart. "My heart lives here now. With you. With them. Always." It is perhaps not the white man's way of asking, nor the full Comanche way of declaring, but I ask you plainly, will you be my wife, Sarah? Will you make this truly our family, bound together before the spirits and all people? Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Not tears of sorrow this time, but tears of profound joy, of overwhelming relief, of a deep love found unexpectedly in the ashes of her former life. "Yes, Coda," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her heart overflowing. "Oh yes, there's nothing in this world I want more." Their decision to marry was met with quiet nods of approval by Willow Song and the people in Standing Bear's camp. In a way, their union symbolized the very blend of cultures, the possibility of peaceful coexistence that Standing Bear was striving to achieve for his people. The immediate challenge lay in how to formalize their commitment in a way that acknowledged and respected both sides of their new, shared life. Sarah, while having embraced much of the Comanche way of life and respecting their traditions, still felt a lingering connection to her own cultural roots, a quiet desire for a blessing recognized by her former world, however distant and complicated that world now seemed. Coda, understanding her need to bridge that gap, readily agreed. Word was sent discreetly into Willow Creek, cautiously inquiring if the traveling preacher, Reverend Abernathy, who visited the small settlement periodically to conduct services, would be willing to perform a marriage ceremony for them at the cabin. It was a bold, perhaps unprecedented request, and they braced themselves for refusal or condemnation. To their considerable surprise, after some deliberation within the settlement, and likely some pragmatic persuasion from Henderson the storekeeper, who clearly saw the practical value in stable, peaceful relations with their Comanche neighbors, the Reverend agreed. He was known as a stern, somewhat austere man, but fundamentally fair, perhaps more concerned with the state of souls than with the color of skin, and possibly saw this unusual situation as an opportunity for outreach, for planting seeds of faith in unexpected soil. The wedding day itself was unique, a poignant tapestry woven from the threads of two vastly different worlds. It took place in the grassy clearing outside their repaired cabin, under the vast, benevolent expanse of the Colorado sky. Sarah wore a simple, clean dress she had painstakingly sewn herself, its collar and cuffs adorned with beautiful, intricate beadwork. Willow Song had carefully made and gifted to her. Coda stood tall beside her, wearing his finest ceremonial buckskins, fringed and decorated with quillwork, his bearing proud and steady. Ethan and Emily, now active toddlers just beginning to confidently explore the world on their unsteady legs, were dressed in miniature versions of Comanche clothing, small tunics and leggings, that Willow Song had lovingly sewn for them. Standing, Bear and most of his small band attended, their presence lending a quiet dignity and solemnity to the occasion, their traditional attire adding splashes of vibrant color against the greening spring landscape. Willow Song stood beside Coda, her weathered face serene, her eyes filled with a deep maternal pride. From Willow Creek came Reverend Abernathy, clutching his worn Bible, along with Henderson the storekeeper and his wife, Jebediah the blacksmith and his wife Martha, who had cautiously befriended Sarah during trading visits to town, and a handful of other curious or sympathetic settlers. They stood slightly apart from the Comanche group, a visual representation of the cultural divide that still existed. But their mere presence was significant, a testament to a willingness to witness, perhaps even to accept. Reverend Abernathy, performed a simple Christian ceremony, reading passages about love, commitment, and the sanctity of family. His familiar words echoed strangely, yet somehow harmoniously in the wild open-air setting, witnessed by people who held vastly different spiritual beliefs. Afterwards, Standing Bear stepped forward and spoke eloquently in Comanche, his words, translated clearly by Coda, offering the blessings and acceptance of the people, speaking of the joining of two individuals, two families, and expressing hope for shared understanding and mutual respect between the two communities living side by side in the valley. There was no grand feast, no elaborate celebration, but Willow Song and several other Comanche women had prepared roasted venison, baked squash, and fry bread, which was shared somewhat cautiously at first between the two groups. Awkward smiles were exchanged across the clearing. Tentative conversations were initiated. Martha complimented Sarah on the beautiful beadwork adorning her dress. Henderson discussed trapping prospects and pelt prices with one of Standing Bear's experienced hunters. It was comprised of small, fragile moments, yet significant. It was a beginning. Life settled into a new, complex rhythm. Coda divided his time between hunting to provide for his family and the community, and assisting Standing Bear in the delicate, ongoing task of mediating trade and relations with the people of Willow Creek. Sarah tended their flourishing garden, cared for the rapidly growing twins, continued to learn more Comanche crafts and language from Willow Song, and slowly began to act as a bridge herself between the two communities. She started visiting Martha, the blacksmith's wife, in Willow Creek occasionally, sharing coffee and conversation, bringing small pieces of her own beadwork to trade for thread or sugar at Henderson's store. Ethan and Emily grew like healthy weeds, chattering happily in a natural, unself-conscious mix of English and Comanche, equally comfortable playing tag with the Comanche children in the cottonwood grove, or watching with fascination as Jebediah worked the bellows and hammered glowing metal in his shop in town, blissfully oblivious to the complex cultural lines their very existence blurred. Prejudice and suspicion hadn't magically vanished. There were still wary glances directed at Sarah and Coda when they went into Willow Creek, hushed whispers sometimes overheard behind cupped hands. Some members of Grey Wolf's departed band, hearing news via runners about Standing Bear's risky experiment in coexistence, sent occasional messages warning against trusting the whites, even accusing Coda of being a Haitsuka, traitor, to his Comanche blood. The infrequent but visible presence of army patrols moving through the region remained a constant low-level threat on the horizon. The peace they were attempting to build was undeniably fragile, the future profoundly uncertain. Yet alongside the challenges there was also undeniable hope. That fall, as the cottonwood leaves turned brilliant gold along the riverbanks, Standing Bear made another bold proposal, a joint harvest celebration. His people had successfully harvested a good yield of corn, beans, and squash from their small, newly cultivated plots. The settlers in Willow Creek had their own crops ready. Why not share the bounty? Standing Bear suggested. Hold a gathering to celebrate collective survival through another season, acknowledge their shared dependence on the land. It was a radical idea, met with considerable skepticism and some outright hostility in town, but Henderson and Reverend Abernathy strongly supported it, and enough settlers eventually agreed, perhaps driven more by curiosity than goodwill, or maybe by a genuine budding desire for better relations. The celebration was held in the wide, flat meadow situated neutrally between the Comanche camp and the settlement. Bonfires burned brightly against the crisp twilight sky, sending sparks dancing towards the emerging stars. Food from both traditions was laid out generously on blankets spread across the grass. Roasted venison and prairie hen, steaming corn stew, sweet pumpkin pies, and baked apples, fresh fry bread, jars of preserved berries. Settlers and Comanche mingled, still somewhat awkwardly, navigating invisible lines but with noticeably less open hostility than just months before. Children from both groups, less burdened by history and prejudice, chased each other through the firelight, their joyous laughter echoing in the cool autumn air, a universal language of play. Sarah stood beside Coda near one of the bonfires, holding Emily's small hand while Ethan toddled nearby, happily chasing a friendly camp dog near Willowsong's feet. She watched the scene unfold, the flickering firelight illuminating the diverse faces, the tentative sharing of food and conversation, the simple, uncomplicated joy of the children playing together. It wasn't perfect. The divides were still clearly present. The deep scars of the past couldn't be erased overnight. But it was undeniably a start. A fragile, precious, hopeful start. Coda put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Look, Sarah," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet sense of wonder and accomplishment. "Look what we are building here. Together." She leaned against his solid strength, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of wood smoke and pine that always clung to him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. They had faced the fury of the blizzard, crossed seemingly insurmountable cultural divides, defied the expectations of both their worlds, and somehow, against all odds, forged a family, nurtured a community in the wild heart of the Colorado mountains. The future remained unwritten, the path ahead still fraught with uncertainty and potential danger. But here, in this moment, surrounded by the tentative, hopeful mingling of two peoples under the vast, starlit sky, there was warmth, there was connection, there was undeniable hope, hope for understanding, hope for peace, hope for the blended world their improbable love had begun to create. And for Sarah, who had faced the deepest despair and stared death in the face, that fragile, hard-won hope felt like the most precious, most vital harvest of all.